Hello there, this is Taras Viktorovich Pluskin from TVP Sustainable Aquaculture Consulting in the University of Florida. And today we will be discussing the current standing of the industry behind the marine polychaete, Nereis virens, and the potential for this species to become another American aquaculture crop. So a little general background on Nereis virens. I'm aware that the scientific name has been changed to Alida virens. I'll be referring to it as Nereis virens just for consistency's sake this time around. Also known as a clamworm, sandworm, ragworm. It's a marine polychaete worm found in various estuarine substrates. Mudworm found in a lot of different substrates. All the way down to Southwest Virginia, northward towards the Arctic, and then over across the pond to France, all the way as north as Norway. It's often around everywhere. There are shellfish and other typical rocky intertidal organisms, but if you really want to be finding them, you really have to be looking during the exposed intertidal when the tide goes out, and you look either dig in the mud or look under structures to find these guys. They're relatively euryhaline because of where they're from. They can withstand a pretty wide range of salinities and temperatures, but salinity and temperature are going to dictate the success of their fertilization. These guys are pretty complex and controversial life cycle, and it's going to dictate the cues behind their gametogenesis and their growth and the like. And they've been the basis of a commercial fishery since at least the 20th century in Maine. They've always been commercially fished over in Europe. They've been very popular as a bait species, and when those stocks really got hit hard, a lot of the focus turned over to Maine, and Maine now produces pretty much most of the world's supply of this particular organism. Some important anatomy. They are able to perceive light. They have photoreceptors on their face. That'll be important for photoreception. They are composed of various body segments that they move rhythmically for locomotion. And as you can see here, they have very charismatic parapodia, which act as gill feathers. These guys have these organs act both for respiratory functions and for locomotion of the worm. Not only can worms burrow with these, but they can also swim around in the water column and crawl on top of the substrate as well. As you'll see in further photos, these guys have very impressive hidden mandibles, which are used for hunting and defense to an extent. And they also have sexual dimorphism. So the males are going to have enlarged parapodia because they're the ones that are going to be swimming around during the mass spawning event. Then they have also enlarged Nereis, so they're able to perceive the hormones given off by the females, and they are able to they'll have these phygidial pores in which they'll be able to excrete seminal fluid. Obviously, females don't require that. Historically, the diet of this species has been pretty contested. It's now pretty well agreed upon that it's an omnivorous species, eating a little bit of anything it can get its hands on, qualifying itself as having both scavenger grazing and carnivorous characteristics. But it is the main infaunal predator in many estuarine systems. It's the biggest critter that's actually in the sediment that's eating other critters. The gut contents of individuals extracted from Maine, for instance, have contained detritus of both vegetable and animal origin. It's considered that this is a very important food source for the juveniles that are too small to take out larger prey. And the adults, their gut contents have revealed similar detritus, macroalgae, eelgrass, zostria, various microalgae, especially benthic diatoms, harpactoid copepods, ostracod copepods, amphipods, various snails and other gastropod species, benthic nematodes, hydrozoans, and polychaetes, both whole polychaetes of smaller species and bits and pieces of other Nereis virens, believed to be consumed during territorial disputes between males or females for burrows. So gametogenesis is a very long process in the wild, though it does accelerate in the fall months, September through midwinter, December. Oocytes take a little bit more than a year to a year and a half to produce. Sperm takes only 8 months. But you can see it's a multiple seasonal process where these oocytes are being built up and built up and built up, and reserves are being built up, and then it's only when there are some key factors within the individual worm status that these final egg maturation stages occur. And the environmental cues behind that are still controversial and somewhat vague. Males will begin their morphological changes, allowing them to be ready for these swarming events. So here we see some photos that I took in Groton, Connecticut. This is in a salt pond where we had a ton of male Nereis virens that I was able to attract near shore in the light. And we can see just how robustly and how concentrated these guys are swimming around in the water column. So in the wild, the lunar cycle and rising temperatures trigger the hormonal shifts within the worms, both that trigger the morphological changes within the males and which potentially trigger the females to release specific pheromones, which will in fact induce the actual mass swarming behavior of the males. And these mass swarming events begin midwinter and it may occur through the May. The last photo I showed you in Groton, Connecticut was occurring May 7th, for instance, of last year. So females remain in burrows, they don't swim, and they receive seminal fluid through the water column as the males are whipping around and releasing it everywhere. The females then take in the seminal fluid, presumably fertilize their eggs, and then broadcast out the embryo. So this is, again, quite vague if fertilization occurs inside the female or outside the water column. So many organisms feed on the males during these swarming events, and of course many different zooplankton enjoy the huge swaths of gametes and larvae that are produced. And then these worms are sempliparous, so after they breed once, they do die. So that's another intrinsically interesting aspect of their life cycle, considering they aren't strict annuals. Like, when do they choose specifically to mature and die? It's quite vague still. Here we have some photos of these mass swarming events. You can see that the males are whipping around the water column. They get tangled in all kinds of things, and they pretty much induce nighttime blitzes of stripers and bluefish that attack these. And they're just whipping around, and I couldn't get good footage at the time, but they will, in fact, just secrete seminal fluid right in front of you and fog up the water. So you can see that the water is a little bit hazy. But this is an idea of just how many can start to accrue in these small areas at a time, whipping around. So now that those embryos are released from within the female, they turn into monotrochophores and then trochophore larvae, both of which I assume are non-feeding. Then they turn into a metatrochophore, and then that eventually metamorphoses rapidly into the nectochaete. So it is this neochaete stage, which I believe is the feeding part of the organism, and then that only lasts for a few days before settling back into metamorphosing into a small version of the adult, and then these juveniles migrate into the sediment and begin to migrate back into the inshore. So here we see, we have the monotrochophore, the trochophore being the epibenthic parts of the larval life cycle, then those becoming the planktonic part of the larval life cycle, the neochaete, and then eventually metamorphosing and returning back into the ebenthic adult stage. So these larval states are not terribly well described. The period in between embryo and settled juvenile is somewhere in between 15 and 20 to 25 days, depending on the water temperature and other environmental factors. Laboratory cultures and experiments that I've read about housing of neochaete larvae. One Russian group was, for instance, feeding theirs white bread. I assume that this has negligible polyunsaturated fatty acid content, so I assume that these guys either have enormous lipid reserves released from the mothers at birth, or they are able, like abalone larvae, to somehow absorb nutrients passively from the water column. But this neochaete stage appears to be a feeding stage, and it's interesting to see in the future if more detailed papers will come out on the feeding mechanisms behind this larvae, and thus increase our understanding and ability to propagate it at scale. So historically, Nereis virens in the 20th century has been used as a bioindicator species. It's been cultured for laboratory use because it's a nice, easily managed and distributed marine polychaete. It's been used for all kinds of bioaccumulation studies to see how much cadmium and heavy metals it'll accumulate from its activity in the sediments, for instance, and also used to see how much copper and polyunsaturated aldehydes, how those could be used to induce reproductive failure in the polychaetes. And then also it's often used as an indicator species for infaunal diversity because it is a top predator of the infaunal community, so it requires diverse and biomass-rich population in order to support high densities of Nereis virens. And of course, it provides a lot of ecological services as well, because in the illustration you see down there, it's aerating the sediment as it's moving and feeding and constructing its tunnels, allowing increased chemical exchange and increased ecological niches for organisms that want more oxygen. And it's also a potential bioremediation organism because of this, because it not only aerates and stabilizes infaunal communities, but because it is a mechanism for taking solid waste and having that waste incorporated in the sediment and then being reduced and aerated continuously. So it's interesting to see, not really going to be discussed too much in this talk, but if Nereis virens could be used as a tertiary wastewater treatment organism. Commercially, Nereis virens has its greatest value as bait species for a variety of mainly benthic marine sport fish. So think flatfish, sole, cod, halibut, sea bass, rockfish, tautog to a limited extent. And these guys are tremendous bait. I've used them myself. Very, very popular, especially with old school, more traditionalist fishermen. And we can see how successful the sandworm, ragworm shape is amongst a variety of different benthic species just because of how many artificial lures are designed to look exactly like them. So this is primarily the greatest commercial value is satisfying the huge demand for recreational fishing with these guys as live bait. So rising demand because more and more people are getting into fishing, despite younger fishermen typically sticking to lures. These guys are still very, very popular as a live bait. And that's led to rising costs, especially with the pandemic, as a lot more people, frankly, have time for fishing. So now particular fishermen will have to travel and kind of badger their way into making sure that they can have sandworms in particular areas when supply is tight during those peak seasons. And they can sell upwards of 25 cents per worm, which for retail value is pretty astronomical. I mean, besides eels, I mean, you're hard pressed to think of some other really higher value bait species, at least up north. Now, like I said, in Europe, ragworms have been harvested for a long time, but those stocks have become saturated, if not overfished, since the late 20th century. And now most of the market focus as far as supply is the Downeast Maine area. So this region is areas of the southern part of the Gulf of Maine where you have a tremendous tidal flux at times, where you have even periods of double tides, where you really have prolonged periods of huge swaths of exposed intertidal mudflats, where you really can support having 100 guys out on a particular spot digging for worms. And that's the industry that's existed since the early 20th century, and that still exists to this day. And it's decent money for this this whole creed of self-employed Mainers that, you know, they hunt for lobster during particular seasons, and when the worms are in, they dig for worms. So this gets fluctuated on a seasonal basis, and you can see that real money can be made if someone's willing to put in the time, follow the worms, chart which grounds to go to, and then, you know, break your back and sweat and dig them out. You know, there is money to be made from this market, and obviously that's attracted more and more people to it over time. Both people that started off as diggers that turned into wholesalers, and then more and more people moving up to Maine in the hopes of having their own self-made subsistence. And that's a way to do this with this fishery, at least as it exists currently. And I'd like to talk about the trade of these worms, which is honestly quite a fascinating little cottage industry, which has survived in Downeast Maine, where you really don't have too much formal industry. So these independent diggers, they can travel from miles around. You know, I want to thank, you know, from the start, I want to thank this guy Skeeta, E.R. Bates. He's a wholesaler up in Maine, and I gave him a call to kind of get some firsthand insight into this industry, because due to the pandemic, I haven't gotten a chance to get up there myself yet. But really fascinating industry, I have to say, where you have these independent worm diggers that travel over 100 miles a day to find optimum grounds, and they keep track of this, and they keep track of the moons and the tides and the temperature. And you know, and some of these tides are double tides, where you can have, you know, 2 periods of exposed, prolonged exposed tides a day, and these younger guys will work that. They'll work a double day, extracting, you know, as many thousand worms as they can. And then these independent worm diggers will bring their product to these worm houses, these distributors, and these distributors will take the worms, and then they'll sort them then and there to see what's quality and what's not. And then basically they'll sell them a price based on a certain grade, how large the worms are and their quality. And if someone doesn't present quality, then they'll be asked not to sell there, or they'll be given a lower price, etc. So it's kind of a fascinating industry where you have these worm houses that organize and distribute the worms to domestic bait stores across the United States, and then international markets in Europe. But they really are kind of experts at keeping these worms alive, knowing their quality. You know, I was interviewing this gentleman, and he was saying, you know, you even get these small cut-up worms, and you get worms that are too small to sell called culls, and they'll take care of them and house them on the spot and make sure they're returned back, because they are aware that they have to an extent, be stewards of this resource. Otherwise, it won't exist. So there's a very, very interesting degree of self-regulation, and this very interesting cottage fishery that exists around these worm species. And I would very much like to see it very soon with my own eyes. I thought it was just quite fascinating. And here's an example of this. Again, very much thanks to E.R. Bates. This is a picture from their Facebook page. So these aren't ragworms. I believe these are different species, but bloodworms. So you can see here, it's like you can get at least 3 guys paid to be processing and boxing these animals full time and housing them. But at the same time, you have this kind of cottage recruitment where a Facebook message goes out where um, worms will be bought on the spot and then pretty much sold on the spot when trucks show up, and wholesalers will organize everything. So it's quite fascinating how organically this distribution happens. So we'll talk about the production cap and potential supply deficits that will be approaching in the future with Nereis virens. Now, the supply remains relatively constant, if not rising a little steadily due to increased amount of population and therefore increased amount of fishermen. But we have some inherent issues that might be confronted. One is overharvesting, which I don't think is at all the fault of the clam diggers themselves. Rather, there needs to be some sort of much more increased and intimate understanding of the demographic, the how the life history of these worms functions and how the population dynamics function, and some sort of management, because no one, even the scientific community, is not entirely sure how the seasonality of worm reproduction works. So how we expect people to keep that in mind when they're just trying to earn a living is a little ridiculous to me. So I think there's a lot of work to do as far as understanding the resource and their population dynamics, knowing what population dynamics fluxes are natural, because I imagine that as with many other species, there are certainly other natural population fluxes. There's certainly effects of environmental change, as we have increased urbanization. Simply the colonization of the Maine coast, however steady it might be, certainly has its own effects on the effects on the mudflats. Competition with coastal landowners apparently is, like everywhere else in the East Coast of the United States, the prevailing issue when it comes to fisheries conflict. Mainly because we have increased local private land ownership of these coastal areas, and they simply do not want to see people working in their front yards, and we have increased legislative conflict there. So we see here that in the future, where we have a trend, especially in the pandemic, of more and more wealthy folk moving off into unsettled rural areas, that there'll be increased competition, because the most desirable real estate in these rural areas is coastal, and that's where people are working. So there are a few issues that may arise where the wild population of Nereis virens is at least capped, if not somewhat inhibited, or the ability to extract that population is somewhat inhibited in the near future. So this leads to the question of why there is no existing aquaculture of this species, and what would it take to have aquaculture be possible for the species. Well, in order to aquaculture the species, you would have to, one, have an increased and more intimate understanding of its life cycle, which, though there are a lot of papers on the life cycle of Nereis virens, very few of them are based around a production standpoint whatsoever. There are efforts, and the life cycle was closed in the early 1980s. However, a lot of that information is proprietary and not extremely publicly accessible. This is a species I would very much like to work with and intend to work with myself in the near future, close its life cycle myself, and therefore I can write a manual where I can stand by more specific techniques. But for now, this slide is going to remain highly generalized, so I don't risk saying anything that I don't know to be accurate. Broodstock conditioning is surely done through manipulation of photoperiod and temperature in order to trick those females into maturing their gametes, and then finally that final ventilogenesis, maturation of the eggs. Artificial spawn induction will likely have to be done through some sort of potential stress cue, as done with other organisms like iodine, sea urchins, for instance, but it could also be potentially induced with some sort of hormone that is extracted and broadcast and used to manipulate this behavior in captivity. Housing of planktonic larvae. There'll have to be a refinement of larval care and how to house them in large densities so that you can get as many juveniles per cohort as possible so that your nursery culture can be as successful as possible. Your nursery culture would likely be tank-based, and likely the biggest production obstacle and barrier between success and failure would be having the ideal age substrate where you can place these settled juveniles and have them feed continuously um, on a substrate which has the proper microbial composition in the detritus that they can just be eating and growing, eating and growing, eating and growing passively until they're ready for grow out into some sort of sea ranching or recirculation system where you can find a way to accelerate them to a full-size marketable worm. And I don't think any of these procedures are impossible, and they have been done, but they have to be refined in such a way that they reach economic scale and feasibility. Some potential strategies for nurturing grow-out methods. So you could seed wild grounds, which has a variety of pros, including no feed input, as you're just having your worms feed on natural critters. Of course, there's going to be high loss of predation. It's difficult to control the collective movement of worms, as they do move collectively independent of spawning events. And it's going to be difficult to quantify the overall return from your investment in the hatchery unless you have a particular block of land which you're cultivating and trying to manage the wild population a certain way. But without total control of all the different mudflats, this is difficult to do so effectively. Another method, which would likely be the one adopted if worm aquaculture were to be a thing in Maine, would be concrete tank culture. You could have a variety of environmental controls with or without water filtration on flow through, or you could have water filtration and just batch fed with a lot of labor, but more control. But at the end of the day, you would end up having a series of tanks where you would be growing out these worms in a relatively controlled environment, but one that would have minimal environmental inputs, probably like a basement or a root cellar or a warehouse. But it would still require feed input, monitoring, and care. But it would branch off well off the existing worm house model, and it could be done, if someone knows the worms well enough, it could be done with minimal capital costs compared to other aquaculture products. And it can also utilize existing fisheries and other infrastructure off season. So if you have something in which you can't do anything else in the wintertime, perhaps you can have a worm farm and start to produce money that way. Just keep people hired. And then the other option is recirculation aquaculture, which is a tremendous high degree of environmental control, but also the highest degree of capital input, all kinds of gadgets that you necessarily can't expect worms to pay for. However, you can have these recirculation systems anywhere and potentially access markets that were difficult to access before. But you would probably need to polyculture worms and have these worms be eating the poop of a much higher value organism, like an expensive halibut or something else. And you would use the worms as a way to capitalize off the waste products of that higher value product. And that's perhaps the greatest advantage of this marine polychaete is its ability to be a suitable polyculture, our companion organism to a variety of established aquaculture organisms in cold water countries, which don't necessarily have robust multi-trophic aquaculture systems as of yet. The first thing that comes to mind is you see down here, this is a salmon cage in Finland. These cages are hugely productive, but they're very energy intensive and they're very nitrogen wasting. And there's even a movement to have more and more of these salmon operations placed in recirculation aquaculture systems. But seeding with worms is a way to reduce this footprint of increased fish waste accumulating on the bottom, and in a way of these fish farms covering their kind of environmental footprint in a way so that they can ensure that they're reducing this detritus and potentially turning it into another marketable product. Recirculation aquaculture with sole and halibut. This has been demonstrated that marine polychaetes can be grown with these species to remove their detritus. The greatest attractive advantage here is that they're directly feasting they're feasting on the leftover feed that the fish missed out on. Feed is the most expensive part of these operations besides electricity, and if feed is not going into the fish, it becomes a liability. So if that feed can be recaptured and then returned to the fish as feed in the form of worm biomass, that's all the better. Remediation of tank and pond mariculture. If you have a hugely productive waste pond or potentially a human sewage treatment plant that has a lot of waste nitrogen that you don't want to poison the local estuary with, perhaps you can put it into a settlement pond where the tertiary stage is having a bunch of polychaete worms which feed off the various organisms that benefit from the nitrogen. And you can recapture that nitrogen in a commercial biomass form. But one of the most attractive and I think the most sensible polycultures was one proposed at the Woods Hole Marine Institute in Falmouth, Massachusetts in the 70s by his fellow Tenore, is polyculture with oysters. So this guy did a bunch of mesocosm experiments with oysters in which these oysters were able to collect all this different suspended material highly efficiently, collect it, and then deposit it either as pseudofeces or feces. So they were sedimenting around by clearing the water column around them. And then this basically allowed a bunch of polychaetes that were also seeded. They loved this oyster detritus, and they had the highest growth rates on this oyster detritus, and much higher with oysters than without oysters. And as every oyster farmer on the East Coast knows, you know you're going to have polychaetes associated with oyster farms. They're just like pigs and dung. They're associated. So the potential to polyculture sandworms with oyster farms is another mechanisms that you can not only diversify the product share of contemporary East Coast American mariculture operation, but you can also improve the sustainable and environmentally friendly footprint in which these worms are actually aerating the sediment and being associated with a stable and faunal ecosystem. So polyculture really is, I think, their glowing Superman cape. And here's a figure from Brown et al. This is an experiment where these flounder were raised in a recirculation aquaculture system, and it expresses the redistribution of the leftover feed and the fish feces into the worm biomass, and then how that worm biomass can be either sold or returned back into the fish. So, like I said, the commercial stocks of Nereis virens in Europe became somewhat exhausted in the mid to late 20th century. Thus, there were two separate initiatives in the 80s by the Brits and the Dutch to aquaculture Nereis virens, and thus they pioneered the closing of the life cycle. And the British in 1984 founded this LTD Seabait, and they hold today a lot of the proprietary information around the spawning and aquaculture of the species. So these guys had admirable initial goals for Seabait in England. The goals being to utilize the waste heat of a power station to maximize the growth of the worms year-round. They wanted to have a fully intensive production of juvenile worms, and then to utilize a series of environmental factors to manipulate the breeding and be able to mass propagate the worms. And they wanted to be able to selectively breed, so you can have faster worms and then for various other traits. So it was an admirable project. And then when that was kind of teetering out, they invested in an operation in Maine. So this is when Seabait Ltd. Of Seabait Maine was formed. And This was exciting because this corporation partnered heavily with the University of Maine Cooperative Aquaculture Center, and some really good work was done furthering the early life cycle work that had been done in the 80s. So in the early 2000s, um, some really sophisticated and cool recirculation aquaculture systems were developed to produce these worms. And then a lot of the aquaculture techniques that were pushed ahead for this, and all the excitement kind of collapsed in 2008 when the mother company in Britain went into receivership, and the industry, Seabait in Maine, dissolved. So there's still research going on today at the University of Maine for the species, but without a major industrial partner. Um, yeah, largely, the industry is reliant on this robust and traditional cottage-based system. But industrial aquaculture has been tried with this species and should be tried again. Um, if not by anybody else, then definitely by me in the future. Here are a couple of photos from a website called Delta Farms, which claims to be a functioning sandworm growing operation in Germany. I couldn't find much contact information to find them directly, but this is kind of the idea of what a postmodern sandworm farm would look like: a huge raceway operation if you're not doing the recirculation route, um, and then basically a way to propagate these worms at scale, where you control this detritus on the food source and be able to reduce ridiculous densities and be able to substantiate the market in ways that the fluxing natural population couldn't. So, a few notes on the sandworm fishery as it stands. Um, it has a need to expand and satisfy existing domestic and international bait markets. However, the pandemic has mixed everything up and closed Europe off as of now, so that surely will has have some sort of localized flux in the supply maybe next season, depending on what happens with COVID-19. Um, there needs to be more substantial studies of the natural Nereis virens populations with modern techniques that we have, so that we can hopefully give this industry of hardworking gentlemen and gentle ladies an idea for what a maximum sustainable yield is per year of worms, so that they know how many they can harvest without preventing their sons and grandsons from having an opportunity to try it themselves. And they want to, and we really do need to encourage and enrich this existing worm industry. And we have to use their inherent knowledge to launch the industry forward, because just a couple phone calls with these guys tells you they know things about worms that do not exist in print. And in order to catch up, you really have to capitalize off the hours they've spent on the mudflats. And with that in mind, we'll talk about the potential for sandworm aquaculture. I think something that really is paramount at the moment is encouraging more hatchery operations for seeding. If nothing else, then goodwill towards the farmers, as many other aquaculture operations started off as well. There really needs to be more and more people working with this species and being able to produce large amounts of larvae in the hatchery uh, if there is ever going to be an aquaculture industry humored. And this would be an appropriate place for government grants to encourage this kind of baseline studying. Um, and really to recognize the potential for this species as another USA aquaculture cash crop, of which we have so precious few, not only as its existing worth as a bait species, but realizing that this is a species that can be used to convert detritus, convert waste into biomass filled with polyunsaturated fatty acids that can be therefore converted and milled into a variety of sustainable feeds. The hunt for sustainable alternatives to fish meal is on, and this is a potential avenue to get on that, and thus can and should be exploited and encouraged by our government. And of course, along with this hatchery operations, to begin to breed two different types of worms. Have the wild worms, which are left alone and allowed to thrive and do their own thing as a fallback, and then to begin to selectively raise aquacultured worms for faster growth and which meet the industrial and consumptive needs of uh, humans. And once again, same as the fisheries, we need to realize our greatest asset is the existing worm houses and the worm diggers. Use their inherent knowledge to launch the industry forward, because the time and the hours they've spent on the mudflats will tell us things about the worms and be able to allow us to utilize this asset in a way that everything in existing print simply will not let us do at this time. So I wanted to thank everyone that listened to this talk. This is a photo from last May when I first saw my first worm swarm as an adult, and it's what inspired me to learn more about this species and the role that it could potentially play in the future of American aquaculture. I think it's a very exciting species, and please contact me with any questions. And I look forward to comprising another talk potentially next year about more detail of the hatchery process of this species. But I want to do it myself before I talk about it. So I want to thank ER Bates and the worm diggers, and everyone stay safe out there in crazy times.